Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everyone, to the show. I appreciate you for joining us. This is going to be episode 26, and today we're going to be talking about nostalgia. The only reason I have this podcast is because I'm so interested in nostalgia. And, we're focusing on sports nostalgia, but there may be projects in the future where we're focusing on other things. And as soon as I decided to do this podcast over a year ago, one of the first people that I knew I wanted to talk to was Dr. Clay Routledge. I heard about Dr. Routledge years ago, before the pandemic, or around the pandemic, I suppose. I heard him on another podcast. And recently I bought his book that we'll be talking about, and I just thought what he had to say was so interesting, and I want to, share with you guys who he is. He's the Vice President of Research and the Director of Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute, and he's a co-editor of Perfectus, a magazine that deals with human progress and flourishing. He's a leading expert in existential psychology, and he focused his work on helping people reach their full potential, build meaningful lives, and spent 2 decades in academia as a professor of psychology, management, distinguished professor of business, and he's taught undergraduate, MBA, and PhD courses in social and personality psychology, cultural psychology, research methods, and team leadership. He's written 100 plus academic papers. He's co-edited a list of books. He's authored 3 books of his own discussing his academic pursuits. In 2022, Clay joined the Archbridge Institute as Vice President of Research, and he's the Director of their Human Flourishing Lab. He is an expert on nostalgia. He's actually one of the first people to actually research what nostalgia is and what it means to all of us. And since nostalgia is the thread that runs through all of our podcasts, we couldn't be more happy to have Dr. Clay Routledge as our guest today. So please, if you like what we do, like and subscribe, and I hope you'll listen to this wonderful explanation from Dr. Clay Routledge about nostalgia and what it does for our lives. Thank you very much. It sounds good. It looks like. All right, everybody. Welcome back to everyone to the GenX Classic Sports Podcast. I'm Shon Enis. I'm your host, and today we have with us Dr. Clay Routledge. And your credentials I've already read in the introduction, but I will say that the 2 important ones are that you're kind of an expert on nostalgia, and number 2, you're a Gen Xer. So that really qualified you for our show purposes. Okay, Clay. And so welcome to Gen X Classic Sports.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, I learned about you during COVID. I was working in an office setting at that point, and they encouraged us to listen to music or podcasts if we wanted to. And I found you on a podcast, and I thought to myself, someone actually studied nostalgia. Like, that was very. I don't have the academic background that you do, but it was something that I kind of thought was not something very many researchers and academics really cared about. Nothing I had seen had referred to it as being a formal study with research and so forth. So can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in nostalgia as a topic, as a researcher and psychologist and so forth?
Yeah, for sure. And your assessment was correct. There wasn't a lot of academic research on nostalgia when I first started studying it. Over 20 years ago now. So my background is in psychology, and I was working on my PhD at the University of Missouri at the time. And what I was actually really interested in was like the human ability to think about the future. That was like what I was most interested in. And both the positive and the negative. So the positive, like that's how we plan, right? That's how we build the society. That's how we plan our futures
Right.
is we're able to sort of project ourselves forward in time. And then I started to think about that also, of course, can create a lot of anxiety. The future's unknown, it's uncertain. And so that can be stressful and worrying. And then I started to think about, well, that same ability that allows us to think about the future also allows us to travel backwards in time. And in fact, we do so often in response to thinking about the future. We think about the future, we get kind of worried or anxious about the uncertainty of it, and we look to comfort ourselves by the past. It's reassuring to look backwards and say, well, I've gone through tough stuff before. I've made it through the other side.
Right.
I've succeeded in various ways. I've learned life lessons, and so then I really started to become very interested in that relationship between nostalgia and our more future oriented thinking. And at the time I was working on my PhD, and my PhD advisor and I we're like, well, there's got to be a ton of research on nostalgia, right? Surely there's a bunch of psychologists who have studied this. And we were surprised to learn that there wasn't a lot. There were some, for sure. A lot of it was actually in consumer psychology, and it really wasn't about understanding like the psychological mechanics of nostalgia. It was more about like understanding consumer preferences. So it turns out, not surprisingly, people like things from their youth: products, styles, music, culture. That was well documented. But why? The answer to why wasn't, and that's what we became really fascinated with. And then 20 almost I guess almost 25 years later, I'm still doing it. So I guess I'm still
Yeah.
fascinated by it.
Yeah, surprisingly, so the listeners need to know. I mentioned it in the intro that I'll record later, but one of your books is called "Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life." When I heard you on this podcast, but basing on the dates in my head, I'll bet you were either in the middle of writing this or had just written it and was in the revision stage. I'm not really sure. But it was definitely before the copyright date on the
Yeah.
book. So this was heavy on your mind, clearly. And so this is kind of what I use to prep for our discussion here. And, you know, one of the things that jumped out to me very early on in the book, well, one you've already touched on, was that relationship that humans have with time.
Hmm.
Sort of how we in our minds go backwards and forwards in time, and sort of how that's unique to us. And, really, you mentioned in the book very early on that there is actually a history of a negative connotation with nostalgia, and I got a real kick out of you explaining the root of the word, where it actually came from, with the Swiss. Was it the
Yeah.
Swiss Army? Could you just briefly say where the word itself came from, and how that was how that was a negative thing for a long, long time?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look back in ancient literature, you can definitely see expressions of the sentiment of what we would call nostalgia, sort of
Yeah.
a longing, a sentimental longing for the past. But it wasn't until 1688 that the term is actually coined, to mean this. Really, it was meant to be like a disease diagnosis and specific. And so there was this. You're right. There was this Swiss physician who, at the time, he actually was a medical student becoming a physician, and he was doing a medical thesis. And basically, he'd coined this term nostalgia to characterize these symptoms that he was noticing in Swiss mercenaries who'd come down from the Alpine homes to fight wars in Europe. And they were singing their old traditional songs from the homeland, and they were sad, and they were suffering, and they were having heart problems and insomnia and disordered eating and all these things, while talking about the homeland. And so he said, "Oh, here's what's going on. This thinking about the homeland, sharing old stories, singing their songs is making them sick. So nostalgia is a disease." And you said you had to laugh because it is hilarious in a way, because at the time there wasn't, we certainly didn't have like brain imaging technology or anything that would allow the kind of sophisticated analysis we have now. And yet that didn't prevent him or his contemporaries from having very specific hypotheses
Yeah.
about what was going on inside the brains of these people, including demonic possessions and evil spirits, and like the clanging of cowbells had caused some kind of damage to the eardrum, which had pushing this blood through the heart of sentiment. Like there was all these wild hypotheses. The punchline being, at that time, and for many decades after, the common view in the medical community was that nostalgia was a disease of the brain. and it was bad
Yes.
news.
And
And
that it held you back,
that
I
it
think.
held you back, right?
Yeah.
Like it was a source of great suffering. In fact, that's, they were like banning these soldiers from singing their songs because they're like, we don't want you to be encouraging these symptoms. And later people figured out, oh, like this isn't just a Swiss. At the time, they thought this was like this had something to do with the Swiss. And then you started to see nostalgic diagnosed in the French and other Europeans, even in the American Civil War. There were quite a few diagnoses of Union soldiers fighting down in the South, who were diagnosed by Union physicians with nostalgia. I think it was World War I. Even was the latest, was kind of like the last diagnosis. But eventually, the physicians realized that this is not what's going on here. This
Yeah.
isn't a disease. But what's interesting is then, like, the psychologists kind of came about in the mid 20th century, and they still saw it as bad, as
Yeah.
holding you back. But they
Right.
thought of it more as almost like a depression, like a failure to thrive. And to be nostalgic was to want to return to the womb because you're not like entering into adulthood fully or something like that.
Right.
So it was very much for the its first couple hundred years, considered, and longer even, considered either a disease of the brain or some kind of psychological dysfunction.
Yeah, that was funny to read, and but it does make me consider the fact that there are people today who don't think positively so much about nostalgia. They think you're
Right?
living. You heard the term living in the past. They think you're not moving on with your life. That's still out there. That sentiment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a very common caricature of nostalgia is that even if, so you'll have people who will even say, well, it's not bad for you, but it's holding you back. Like
Yeah.
it's getting in your way. Like it's a
Yes.
barrier. And so, yeah, that's a fairly common view. Interestingly, it's more of a common view by social commentators, than it is by the actual public, because we've
Right.
surveyed the public, and most Americans actually see nostalgia as a fairly healthy thing that helps them move forward with their life. But that's not how it's often characterized in the media.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, and I'll probably skip around and drive you crazy, but you mentioned earlier the knowledge of how this impacts marketing, and that was kind of where my notes led next, because I think when we think of nostalgia and marketing, we see the obvious things with music and
Hmm.
movies and so forth. For what I do here, yeah, I'm very interested in pop culture, but there's a whole nostalgic side of sports that's certainly what I'm trying to capitalize on,
Hmm.
because I thought on this on podcasts in general, the Gen Xers weren't really served so well with looking back into some of the things specifically in the athletics that we grew up with. There are tons of podcasts about movies and music, and I didn't really feel like entering that space. But there's a lot of marketing around the fact that people look longingly backwards into a lot of the sports stuff. So I definitely see how marketing and takes advantage of nostalgia. We all do, but I just kind of have noticed over the course of the podcast, talking to different people, we look back fondly on Sears catalogs for merchandise. Like,
Mm.
you're a Gen Xer, you know that you
Yeah.
couldn't find just anything out and about in stores. The Sears catalog or Montgomery Ward had all kinds of things you couldn't just walk in necessarily
Right. Right.
and buy. And so we've kind of laughed at the fact that all of us, what merch existed in the 70s and 80s, we got it out of the Sears catalog. There's definitely, a nostalgic pull today to things like that when they're selling their sports fans merchandise and so forth, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great insight on your part that there is a lot of nostalgia like content out there about movies and music, but less conversations, public conversations about sports, even though, like you said, it's such a prominent feature of culture and of, like, people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed there's even 80s. This is really crazy. There's 80s themed cruises. I don't know if you know that, but there are cruises built around 80s music and 80s themes. So,
Yeah.
you dress 80s and then, Poison or whoever plays on the cruise. And, that's really interesting. And then there's Comic Cons. I went
Hmm.
to a big Comic Con in Dallas. It's Fan Expo is what they call it. I took my kids out there to meet Stan Lee years ago, and
Oh,
there
that's
were
awesome.
tens of thousands of people at this thing. So I think I knew all along that those things were easy, but I wanted to dig into where the things are that are happening for the sports fans that long back to those days. And I'll tell you what I came up with. One of the things there's card shows. Baseball cards and sports
Hmm.
cards are kind of making a comeback right now.
Yeah.
And so when you have a card show, that's your opportunity to really go meet what I affectionately call old timers. You can go to those and get autographs, and they'll sign your whatever posters, glove, bat, you name it. So that's one attempt at kind of cashing in and making you think about that. But also, I don't even know if you're aware of this, but there's a whole kind of an industry within the industry now on what they call throwbacks, throwback uniforms, throwback
Mm.
jerseys. They make the Major League Baseball and the NFL. They make their teams play in jerseys from prior eras or uniforms from previous
No, I
eras. Like
did not know that.
the Packers have a helmet that's just like I think brown, and then they have this old gold and blue thing, and of course the whole point is yes we're keying into your nostalgia, but they're also selling that stuff after the game. so
Right. Right.
so marketing is such a part of, or nostalgia is such a part of marketing, and that's what I've found in the sports world anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And if I could say one thing about the marketing thing, because I often come across this sentiment, or I'm directly asked about it, that takes sort of a cynical view of that. Like, oh, the it's this nostalgia marketing is not, it's uncreative, and it's mainly it's kind of like just like cashing in on like
Yeah.
people's like memories, and I think that's not a not a totally accurate view. One, oftentimes there are very creative flourishes involved in how marketing takes elements of the past and makes them relevant or accessible for today. And that's just one point. But second, people love this stuff. Like
Right. Right.
people act like, oh, we're being somehow manipulated by nostalgia marketing. It's like, no, that there's a market demand for it. Like
Right.
people love it, and they like sharing it. I mean, when you were talking about going to the convention, when I was in, this is kind of random, but when I was in high school, I actually went to a Star Trek convention. I won tickets for it. Remember when you used to call in to radio
Oh,
shows?
absolutely, yes.
And I got these tickets and to go to this. I think I got like four tickets, and it was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was too far. I wasn't old enough for my parents to let me go, so my mom, my awesome mom,
Yeah.
took me, my brother, and a friend to the Star Trek convention, and it was incredible. And one of the things that I thought was really neat about it, that I thought about, I think at the time I didn't actually fully appreciate as much as I do now looking back on it, is the intergenerational component. You had
For
like the
sure.
old school fans, right, who grew up
Mhm.
watching the original series.
Mhm.
And then you had people like me, the Gen Xers, who, you know, were into the movies,
Right.
but also was watching the Next Generation. That was kind of like the show that was in Deep Space Nine. I think were sort of the big shows at the time, and you saw this dialogue right between the people that were new coming to it, and then the old fans excited to show them the old stuff, and the younger people being excited to learn about that and feel connected to that. And I'm curious your thoughts on how, if there's a parallel to sports, but I feel like that so much of nostalgia and pop culture is that it's like passing on the torch of an idea or an experience or a franchise or something, and then being like, okay, now it's your turn to make it your own, but you need to be you need to be connected with its history.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There is a sports component to that, and that kind of dovetails to really where I was going with the notes, which is you mentioned a lot in this book about nostalgia strengthening and building relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've heard you say on a podcast that you got your son into action movies when he was
Mm-hmm.
what, a teen. I've done the same thing with my kid. I mean, I he grew up on Rambo
Yeah.
and Arnold and the good stuff, the
Yeah.
classic.
Yeah.
And now, though, our common ground is more like John Wick or
Yeah.
whatever you move into together. So I exposed him to what I had grown up on, and then we found some common ground together. So there's no doubt there's this component of this where you strengthen and build relationships, and a perfect example of that is sports teams are handed down almost in the family. I mean, they
Mm.
really are. A lot of sons grow up with the pressure to root for who dad roots for, whether it's the college or the pro or whatever. And my
Yeah.
son kind of struck out on his own early on, and he was kind of rooting more for individuals because of the way they're marketed. But
Mm-hmm.
then he started noticing who I rooted for and how passionate I was and my friends and whoever. And so he slowly just kind of joined in.
Mm.
And it is that way. And proof of that, and I made a special note to research this so I could give you these numbers because you need to hear this.
Okay.
The Green Bay Packers, okay, the Green Bay Packers, they're unique in that they are municipally owned. And what my understanding of that is there's shareholders, but there's no individual owner. So they are a community owned football team. They're the only one like that. And their waiting list for season ticket holders has 147,000 people on it.
Oh, wow.
And that's a 50-year wait roughly. And their tickets are routinely passed down in people's wills as part of their trusts and settling estates. They literally leave their season tickets to family, which is why this list doesn't shorten because they can't get these tickets out of individual families that are now 3 and 4 generations into it.
Mm.
So, absolutely, there are parallels between the Star Trek fans and Star Wars and whatever it may be with sports. It's same thing with colleges, but the pro college doesn't matter. Even individual athletes, I'm a Michael Jordan guy. My son grew up with LeBron James, so we can
Mhm.
argue about that for the rest of our lives, probably. And
Yeah.
so, yes, there's definitely a component of that. But I loved your section about how this builds and sort of makes relationships flourish because of this common ground that of nostalgia over these things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and it has this. It's across time, right? Like, so it's
Yes,
like we're
yes,
talking about the generations. It transcends generations. It's across space often. So the sports thing might have more localized components, but you have a lot of things that are shared communities of interests that you can give you a way to like be in contact or in conversation with people that might otherwise be a lot different from you, which I think is
correct.
sort of an underappreciated value of nostalgia. It's finding something that makes us like see that we have something in common, even if we disagree about lots of other things or we have totally different life experiences. And so I just think that's a really neat component of it. That's often, like I said, it's often not thought of because, going back to the sort of stereotypes about nostalgia, people tend to think of nostalgia, or like nostalgia is often portrayed as being like a dogmatic, it's like, oh, like you're stuck in the past. When in reality, a lot of times it's like, no, it's a very expansive thing because it gives you a way to connect with other people. It's almost it's almost like an icebreaker. Like it gives you something to share, to talk about, and then that opens the door for you to discover other things of interest.
Yeah, you're reading my mind because I was going to move from the relationship side of it to this connection to groups that you
Hmm.
mentioned in the book. And you actually used the example of alumni and sports fans for colleges.
Hmm.
So you picked up on that and you're very accurate about that for sure. And my kind of note to that is like you mentioned this earlier about there's maybe more regional and local appeal. That's true, but there's also another level of sports fandom where there are national appeals
Mm.
regardless of what pocket of the country you live in. You might be a part of a tribe that's more national. For example, a great example would be the New York Yankees. There
Mm.
are grandfathers and uncles and fathers who lived in the South, and maybe everything in their family told them they needed to be Cardinals fans, but for whatever reason, they saw Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio, and way up there in New York, and now their grandkids are Yankees fans, and they may live in down in the deep South. There's no explanation for that other than that part of the group it's nationwide. There's Yankees fans in every pocket of this country
Yeah.
because they're so national.
Yeah.
Boston Celtics are the same way. Los Angeles Lakers.
Mm.
The Green Bay Packers are another good example. There,
Mm.
you find Packers fans anywhere you go. Pittsburgh Steelers. So um, I was going to tell you that based on where you live and where I live, obviously the Razorbacks and the SEC sports are really
Mhm.
big down here. But one of the things we've laughed about on this podcast is one of the guys that helps him with this. He grew up a Notre Dame fan, and so I kind of help him root for Notre Dame. And so I went to Notre Dame with him on a trip one time to watch a game, and it was such a fantastic experience. But I have a Notre Dame cap on, and it doesn't
Mm.
matter where I that I
Yeah.
wear. Doesn't matter where I go. If somebody sees that Notre Dame cap, they'll say, "Are you lost because you got a Notre Dame cap on?" And you instantly click with someone, and they say,
Yeah.
"Well, yeah, I don't tell everybody, but I'm a Notre Dame fan too." You know,
That's great. I mean, it's interesting because one thing that people often do when they're nostalgic is it's a form of like disclosure. Like it's sharing something about yourself, and
I love
even if
that.
somebody doesn't share that specific nostalgia, they get it because they also have their own story. They might say, "Well, that's not my team,
Right.
but I appreciate that." And I liked your example of like if you have a friend or someone that is rooting for something, then you might temporarily join there. It's like
Yes.
to be part of that.
Yes.
And no, I think that's a great point. And there's so many ways that we share. Um, it's kind of like share culture in and people talk about the US as like a melting pot, for example, and even things like in cuisine, in cuisine we talk about like we talk about fusion food. Somebody will say, "Oh, I brought this type of food to this region and I put this spin on it." And
Right.
so I don't know how applicable that is to sports, but in general you often have this mixing and matching of cultural content that is weaving together different people's nostalgic memories. And they might say, "Well, when I was growing up, this was a big thing. This made a big impact on me, and I want to share it. I want to share." That's why people will start a restaurant, right? They'll say,
Absolutely.
I want to share this that's so meaningful to me. They're my memories, not yours, but I want to share them with you." And so the way that nostalgia can be contagious and can be spread to impact other people, I think is another like great feature of it.
Yeah, within that discussion about belonging to groups, I don't know how active you are on social media, but I've noticed on like Facebook groups, I've even gotten involved. I'm a part of groups that are based on nostalgia regarding toys, like the Star Wars stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
there's Reddit threads that are dedicated to nostalgia, and there's so much out there now if you're really looking for it, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
that make you feel part of a collective,
Mm-hmm.
in just about any category, so to speak, you can think of,
Yeah.
from your nostalgic past, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these things interface, right? Like somebody might
Yeah,
be like
yeah,
if you're a sports fan, then, like I know you've talked about movies in your podcast. If you're a sports
right.
fan, oftentimes that intersects with sports movies, or sports are featured in a movie, or there's a soundtrack it's got music that ties to sports, or video games, so it's funny because I wasn't really like a big like baseball fan, but I always enjoyed playing like video games. And
Yeah,
you'd play with
yeah.
people that were more diehard fans. So there's all these different ways that they cross pollinate into different mediums, and that's another interesting way of kind of sharing your nostalgic memories is through that other type of content.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't plan to do it, but a couple of our episodes, maybe three, have been about classic sports movies. That's sort of my way into the movie thing, and those have been some of the most fun ones that we've done. And there's so much material to pull from. That's the great part about it. You also moved from the collective nostalgia in the book. You talk about historical nostalgia. Now, this
Mm-hmm.
is where, as a parent, it really spoke to me because I've heard you mention it on podcasts, and I kind of saw some evidence of that in the book. How you can be nostalgic for a time that you didn't even live in. Can you talk about that for just a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to, because this is actually a big area of emphasis right now in my work at the Human Flourishing Lab, because we actually just published a national survey on historical nostalgia. I've been doing some work, some advising work with different companies, and this was a question that kept coming up. And this is one of those interesting insights where I didn't come to it on my own as a researcher. I kept doing this kind of consulting work, and it kept coming up where they would say, we have all these, we have all these customers. For instance, I worked with a streaming service that said, we have all these young people watching old TV shows. They're watching Friends, but Friends came out, before them. It seemed to be like Gen Z was watching all this old content. And what's that about, right?
Right.
And so we started looking into that more and more. And I've written about it some because it definitely seems like a thing. But we tried to try to do some more like empirical work around it. And then what we found, which was kind of surprising, is younger generations are very historically nostalgic, which we define as nostalgia for an era that predates your own lifetime. And one of the discoveries we made is a lot of it has to do with people feeling like, just like our own memory, we turn to our own nostalgic memories when we're trying to solve a problem often. It doesn't have to be like a devastating problem or anything like that. It could
Right.
just be like, we're kind of anxious about learning a new technology. And then our nostalgic memories can remind us, oh, we've done new things before. Like we've been bold before, we've had experiences before, and we were fine. And so we often do that with our own memories. But with historical nostalgia, it seems to allow people the opportunity to tap into other more broadly shared experiences that predate them. So right now we have a lot of young people who grew up as digital natives, for instance. They don't remember a world before the internet. They don't remember a world before smartphones. And they're fascinated with analog technology. It's something we're finding, right? They're one of the main consumer drivers of vinyl record sales increases. They're buying physical CDs again. When I was a college professor, I remember talking about buying CDs, and students laughing out loud in
Right.
my class.
Same
They're like, "You buy
experience.
CDs?" And I was like, "Yeah, I still buy and play audio CDs." And
Right.
they were laughing. But now, like, it's a thing, and people are coming around to the idea of maybe there's something about the tangible experience of listening to music in a way that's more intentional, that's it's more you get to handle something, you get to look at art, you put it in, and then it's set like you're playing it. And there's something cool about that. And like, to be clear, what we're not finding that it's a zero something. It's not the case that they're saying I don't want Spotify
Right.
anymore. What they're saying is I want both, right? They're
Right.
saying I still want the modern conveniences of technology. It's great to be able to pretty much listen to anything you want at any time. But there's also something nice about curating physical media for the special things we like that we think kind of help characterize who we are. I buy, for instance, 4K Blu-ray discs. Like, I have the streaming services like everyone else, Netflix and HBO Max and all that stuff. Um, but the movies I really care about, I like having the physical media. I like looking at it. I like putting it in the player. There's just something, and that's not even like, and I guess you could say it's technically is a little bit superior to streaming it. Um,
Yeah.
but um, but I enjoy all that, right? It's not
Right.
necessary, but I enjoy it, and we're just finding that a lot of young people are interested in that. And it's further evidence to me that it's not this like regressive like way of being, because what they're saying, they're not saying I want to reject modern technology. What they're saying is there's something about the past that we feel we've lost touch with that we want to access, and it's from before our time, and they're finding like clever or creative ways to integrate it into their lives. And when I talk to people who are very critical about nostalgia and who see it as kind of backward looking and uncreative, it's kind of easy to help like persuade them if you give them an example of like, think about an important artist in your life. Like this could be a filmmaker, a musician. Think about what they do and how often they pull from the past. They'll talk about if they're a filmmaker, they'll talk about the movies they grew up on, and they might be doing cutting edge movies, but they are pulling from that to say, I wanted to give a nod to this, or I wanted to do this because this is what got me into loving movies to begin with. Musicians do it all the time. They integrate like old sounds and ideas. They pay tribute to the artist that inspired them. So if you look in the creative spaces in which we think people are actually doing pretty innovative stuff, you often find a very, very strong nostalgic impulse. It's the same case in engineering. I'm talking to somebody at Mercedes Benz, and their design team, they're very focused on the idea that people want the new, they want fuel efficient, safe
Right.
vehicles. They want to take advantage of all the progress that's been made to make cars, safer and more comfortable. But turns out people are starting to be like, oh, those the analog, the old knobs were nice. Like there's something tactile about being able to feel something that you can't necessarily do with a touchscreen. There's certain design aesthetics that people look back on and are like, oh, that was really cool. That was a really cool era for the aesthetic of the car. Like, can we integrate some of that look into it while still having the modern things? And so you see it once you start looking for it, you see nostalgia everywhere, and historical nostalgia you see everywhere. It's just integrated into like modernity in a way that's like, can we pull the things from the past that we like and not give up the advances that we think are improvements? And I think that kind of creative integration is really makes nostalgia, including historical nostalgia, a very like future oriented endeavor.
Right. There's some sports equivalents there for sure. One of which is the way they design stadiums. Like every baseball fan wants their stadium to look like it was from the early 1900s, because
Mm.
that was just a standard classic look. And you see them spend $2 billion on modern stadiums where they really did their best to make it look old school. Now it's got all the modern conveniences,
Hmm.
but they look from the outside now like maybe it could have been built in the 30s or something. That's
Mm.
one way I see it. There,
Yeah.
there seems to be a lot of pull for that from the fans. And then the other way is just kind of a personal deal where, just speaking of the historical nostalgia, is like, just like my son, it's one thing to argue with him about athletes that were better or teams that were better and so forth, but he can actually go on YouTube and look at it. So technology is kind of
Yeah.
providing the opportunity to kind of live back there in your mind a little bit more, because it's right there at your fingertips. So you can go watch Babe Ruth hit a baseball on YouTube, and I find that fascinating,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so my son can always find someone or some team or some game and go back and pretty much find it. And when he was younger, we were talking about the NBA slam dunk title, and I told him, I said, a guy that was like 5'7" won that when I was in the 90s
Mm.
or in the 80s. And he said, anyway, the guy's name was Spud Webb. And I don't think he believed me. He was sixth or seventh grade. And I told him that it's out there. You can go watch a 5'6" guy win the NBA slam dunk title. It's there. So it's things like that where, um, you know, he really wants to go see what dad grew up with. Why does
Yeah.
dad have these strong opinions about these teams and athletes? Let me go see for myself. Now, our generation, I feel like we had to kind of take our old man's word for it, right?
Yeah. Right.
Unless you wanted to go to the library and look something up. We didn't have access like they do. So
Yeah.
I, I,
Yeah.
I find that really, really cool, actually.
No, I agree, and I think that's when I'm often asked like, is nostalgia, is this kind of nostalgia increasing? And it's hard to answer, but But I think one thing that speaks to that is, like you said, it's just more accessible. Like it's easier to access the past than ever.
Yes.
And like I said, I did some work with a streaming service, and that was one of the things. It's like, well, it's just a lot easier to watch these old shows. When I was a teenager, young adult, I would have had to like try to find a copy of it on VHS or DVD. Um, and that was just much harder to do. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
Well, and for sports stuff, it would have been close to impossible. You might
Yeah,
would have lucked into some movies or albums and stuff that you thought were gone, but you'd almost have no chance with a sports kind of thing. So,
yeah. No, that's
um,
actually. Can I ask you a question real quick?
absolutely.
To that point, given that sports is such a live media,
Right.
and that's obviously like a big issue with the like kind of like cable and streaming service sort of business, is people like to watch sports live, right?
Right.
Compared to like a movie. How do you think that influences, or does that influence, like the nostalgic experience, that a lot of its power is like not knowing who won the game?
Yeah, I kind of, I think I see what you're saying there. Yeah, there's definitely something there. There's some connection there. For sure. It's really interesting as or at least the people I know, as we age, we kind of pull away a little bit from going to things in person and kind of say, well, I'd rather watch it from my recliner or
Hmm.
whatever the case may be. But the live aspect of sports has always been that's a big draw, so to speak. It's funny because wrestling is just the opposite. Wrestling is predetermined outcomes, and people
Mm.
still wrestling's something you want to watch in person as opposed to television. Don't
Mm.
just take my word for it. We've done 3 podcasts on wrestling, and wrestling is so different in person compared to on TV. Knowing that the good guy's probably going to win doesn't matter. You just want to see it live, win or lose.
Mm.
The real deal, where it's not predetermined, it's kind of I think that is the whole point, is that you just don't know. Any given day, anybody can beat anybody. That's kind
Yeah,
of what guides sports fans into their crazy fandom, is that everyone has a chance theoretically. So
yeah, yeah.
um,
No, I love
yeah,
that. Yeah.
there's a lot that could be, just you could dive pretty deep into that for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, the one sport I was, I'm not a big sports person, but the one sport I was into a lot growing up was boxing, and it's a
Yes.
very nostalgic. And the reason is it was the thing my dad was into.
Yep.
My dad, when he was younger, boxed, and growing up, I don't remember watching a lot of sporting events. We would occasionally go to like a Kansas City game, or we'd go. We went a couple times to see the Cardinals in St. Louis. I grew up in Missouri, and so we would on occasion go to something like that. But it wasn't a big aspect of our lives. But whenever there was a pay per view fight involving Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, George Foreman, Lennox Lewis, that generation of boxers, the '80s. It stands out as a nostalgic memory to me that my dad would first of all spring for that because we didn't have a lot of money and he was pretty
Right.
cheap. um, but he'd spring for that, and other guys would come over, and I just remember being a kid and like being like really stoked about that. Like that was a good experience. And then it's funny because that sort of turned into an interest in ultimately I started following more like UFC, like a more like
Right.
the mixed martial arts. But it was definitely grounded in I think that early history with watching those boxing matches with my dad, and that feeling of that connection to him.
Yeah, my dad, they're probably similar age. Mine's not with us anymore, but he would tell me that he remembered on Friday or Saturday nights before television, all the men in the neighborhood would gather and listen to the boxing matches from like Madison Square Garden on the
Yeah, yeah,
radio. And when Tyson became popular for people our age, I mean, he was just it. And
yeah.
my dad would say, "Boy, you should have seen Muhammad Ali when he was younger."
Oh wow, yeah,
And then he would say, "I wished you could have seen Rocky Marciano," because at the time I had there would be
right,
no way for me to see Rocky Marciano box, and I haven't looked. He may be on Netflix. I mean, YouTube. But my dad would say stuff like that, and I'm thinking, oh wow, yeah, they grew up going to the movies and seeing their highlights
right.
before a movie on a reel, So we've come a long way. But yeah, I think the boxing thing. My dad was the same way. Boy, if you like Tyson, I wish you'd seen Ali when
Yeah,
he was younger. And we did the same thing. I remember my uncle paying a fortune to watch Tyson knock Spinks out in like 91 seconds
I
or
know.
whatever it was. Right? I
Yeah.
remember sitting there watching that.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And my dad's not alive anymore either. But when so I kind of have these nostalgic like reflections on that kind of stuff, and I just that definitely stands. So I can see how that connection between parents and children around sports is so powerful because it often is, and as we already talked about, nostalgia is very relational, and oftentimes our nostalgic memories involve other people and things we're doing that we're interested in, like we're directed towards something we're interested in, but we're sharing that interest with someone, whether it's sports, music, movies, video games. Um, there's almost always other people involved in the things that make us
Yeah,
nostalgic.
and I love that the thread through pretty much this whole book for you was really all of this kind of points back to relationships with loved ones and
Yeah.
friends and so and that's kind of what I like about it. I mean, you even point out that negativity sort of takes you to nostalgia because you might have a rough time of whatever it is, and nostalgia kind of fuels your fire to do better or change
Yeah.
things or whatever it may be. You even mentioned nostalgia, to be personal about it. You even mentioned nostalgia fueling creativity, and that's why we're talking right now. I mean,
Hmm.
during COVID, when you're sort of a pseudo writer and you don't know what you want to write about, it's tough. And blogging was something that I tried and didn't enjoy that much, but I saw the whole world moving from reading. I hate to say this as a former educator, but I saw the world moving more from reading as far as absorbing things into listening and watching. And so I thought, well, that's not my deal. I'm not making movies or documentaries, but that's kind of what led me to podcasting. That sort of gave me the juice, thinking about all of this and realizing that Gen X was a little underserved in an area, I thought. So I think nostalgia for sure is related to creative juices and getting them flowing. I mean, there's no doubt about that to me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's how we connect with youthful energy and that kind of sense of like courage or like experiment, like we can try something new, we can do
Yeah.
something that kind of pushes us in a new direction, to tap into that, to
Yeah.
kind of tap into that energy.
Even if it's slightly rebellious, right? I mean,
Yeah,
there's nostalgia in that, even, correct? I mean,
yeah,
when you think back to being maybe you're a teenager and going against the flow or whatever, there's certainly a
yeah,
nostalgic slant to some of that.
absolutely, yeah,
I'm gonna stop the recording, Clay, but then can you hang for just a second?
yeah, yeah.
All right, so we're gonna stop the recording here, and Clay, I really appreciate you coming on with us. And I told you I wouldn't bug you too much about sports, and I think this was fantastic, man. I appreciate it. I'm gonna stop the recording right here. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me.
All right.
Thank you for joining us on Gen X Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.